ready to go. And then we're going to do it in the order that you show up in the program. So it'll be Rex, and then Matthew, and then Ellery. Oh, and I'm keeping time, by the way. So if you are getting up towards that 10-minute mark, I'll just give you a quick little wave and let you know. And if you get too much past it, I'll have some nice solution. But I'm sure that you all have practiced these in and out, so you know you're going to know your time parameters. With that said, that's whenever you're ready.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Rex Curtis, and my thesis uses Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein as both a guide and a warning for the progression of artificial intelligence, both in the modern era and in the future. And in my paper, I cover a very wide range of artificial intelligence, which I define in my paper as any system or machine that performs the tasks or makes the decisions that a human being would make in the same situation, obviously with the added benefits of it being more proficient, more efficient, more precise, and at a much faster rate. For this presentation, though, I want to focus specifically on one area of artificial intelligence, and that's how it is applied in military weaponry, specifically military drones that carry out missile strikes. And I start in my paper by comparing Victor Frankenstein to a real-life scientist in Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer was the lead physicist and project leader for the Manhattan Project, which was developing the atomic bomb for use in World War II. And of course, as we know, it was used in 1945 on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I do this for two reasons. One, it establishes a clear, legitimate link between fiction and reality, and it also gives us the opportunity to track the progression of a scientist that is very similar to Victor Frankenstein in the real world, and they share a lot of similarities. I want to focus mainly on two themes that have to do with their justification of their pursuit of their final goal. And those two themes are the idea of good versus bad, or pros versus cons, and the idea of fate or inevitability. And to focus on the good versus bad first, here at the top left, under Victor Frankenstein, I quote him, and he says, in regards to his pursuit, that I was encouraged to hope that my present attempts would at least lay the foundations of future success. So it's clear through his use of the words, at least, that even if he fails, even if his creation turns out to be something that he didn't intend, or the consequences come out and he did not think about them, albeit he doesn't think about them really at all, if that happens, he still believes his pursuit to be noble enough and beneficial enough that it will benefit mankind in the long run. And that he adds to this idea when he says that his creation will pour a torrent of light into our dark world. And it's not just lighting a candle or lighting a lamp, it's a torrent of light, which means he believes so strongly in his endeavor that he thinks it's going to be that impactful. And if we look at to the top right under Robert Oppenheimer, we can connect this idea with his sense of good versus bad, or pros versus cons, in putting an end to World War II. And this obviously was a conflict that saw death and tragedy on a scale that had never been recorded. And so to him, even though this bomb would be killing people, he thought that ending the war and preventing further death was worth that, and specifically preventing further American loss. And transitioning into the theme of fate or inevitability, at the bottom left here we have a quote from Victor Frankenstein, and he says, "Natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate." And what he's referring to here in natural philosophy is science, really. But what he means is that once he discovered that subject, he was drawn to it. And the course he takes after that throughout the story, discovering the cure of death, giving life to things that are lifeless, he describes that as inevitable and unreversible. So once he was on that track, he couldn't go back. And this removes sort of blame or guilt from Victor's character. And that's very important when we look at Robert Oppenheimer, because he found the same idea of fate, but he found it in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a holy book of the Hindu religion. And in that story, two cousins go to war with each other over both the throne and their overall family inheritance. And the main character, Prince Arjuna, he arrives at the battlefield, and he looks over to the other side, and he sees old friends, family, childhood mentors, and teachers, and he's suddenly overcome with a feeling of guilt, because he can't justify fighting in this battle and killing those people. But luckily for him, the god Krishna is incarnated as his charioteer. So he gets to ask Krishna for advice and ask him, how do I justify fighting in this war? And I'm going to quote here from James Hijia, who's a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts. And he summarizes Krishna's argument of fate by saying that Krishna, not Arjuna, will decide who lives and who dies. And Arjuna should neither mourn nor rejoice over what fate has in store, but should be sublimely attached to such results. So again, we have this idea of inevitability, that what will transpire was going to happen anyway, and you need to play your part in destiny. You're almost duty-bound to play your part in destiny because you have no control over it. You need to simply live your life and be okay with the outcomes. And this would have been very relevant for Oppenheimer, who would have seen the invention of the atomic bomb as inevitable. And if it weren't him to discover this or to create this, it would have been whoever was next in line for his position. And if it weren't the Americans, it would have been the Nazi regime, who were also working on the same technology. So for him, it was inevitable that this thing would be created, and he was already at the helm, so he might as well continue. And I want to keep these two themes in mind as we transition into artificial intelligence, both the theme of good versus bad and the theme of fate. Now, I'm going to start off with the theme of fate or inevitability, and I'm going to quote from Edward Geist, who is a MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow at Stanford University. And he says that because of the long-standing connection between artificial intelligence and research and military, and he's referring to World War II when the first artificial intelligence was used with weapons on torpedoes, and they could locate and destroy targets on their own. It's already too late to forego an AI arms race. One is well underway. Today, we face a choice between a well-managed AI arms race that reinforces mutual security and a poorly managed one that could lead to disastrous outcomes. So here we see again the theme of inevitability, that once we've started on this track, which we have, it's inevitable that we're going to carry it into a very dangerous place. And if you look at Oppenheimer with the atomic bomb, obviously that didn't just go away. You don't get to go back to the time before that was a reality. And so he suggests not trying to stop it, but trying to manage it. And that's really what this presentation is about, is a guide for that management in Frankenstein. And so I want to transition now to good versus bad as it pertains to drones. And the benefits seem pretty obvious on the surface. The primary one being that we don't have to put any American soldiers on the ground or have any American soldiers fly the plane. It's an automated plane that goes based on satellite calculations. It can be controlled by hand from a base, but there are a lot that are just programmed. And because of this, we're saving American lives. And I want to emphasize that we're saving American lives. We don't put them at risk. Also, in theory, like I said before, it would be more efficient, it would be faster, more accurate, again, in theory. And it doesn't have the possibility of human error, and it doesn't have the liability of having to rest or take breaks. It can go as long as its power sustains it. And some of them have solar panels on top of them, so theoretically it can go as long as the sun shines. But there are some glaring problems, and chief among which is brought up by Matthew Schiavenza of The Atlantic in 2015, and he says that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimates that the 415 drone strikes launched in Pakistan since 2004 have killed between 2,449 and 3,949 people. Of these, between 400 and 1,000 have been civilians. So if we give this the best odds and we say that the least possible amount of civilians were killed at 400 and the most casualties were inflicted at around 4,000, that's still 10% innocent casualties, which is horrific. It's chilling, and that's the best case scenario. He goes even further, again along the lines of inevitability, and says that civilian casualties are inevitable, and he's referring to drone strikes. And the U.S. appears willing to accept them. So we see here the good outweighing the bad. We save American lives, and so we seem willing to accept these innocent civilian casualties because we're saving our own lives. And here, we view those casualties as inevitable, an inevitable part of war. And so if it's going to happen anyway, we think we might as well continue what we're doing, just like Robert Oppenheimer and just like Victor Frankenstein. And I want to tie this specifically into another character from Frankenstein, in Robert Walton. And he's an explorer who's looking for the North Pole. And as he's going through the Arctic, he comes across Victor Frankenstein, who's stranded in the Arctic. He takes him on board, and it's because of quotes like this next one that prompt Victor to tell him his story. And it's this story that convinces Robert to turn around and save his life and the lives of his men. And I'll quote from him right now when he's describing his passion for his endeavor. And he says, "I would sacrifice my fortune, my existence, my every hope, to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race." And again, we see that he believes his pursuit to be so noble and so beneficial that he's willing to forego all these sacrifices. He doesn't care about the price he has to pay for it. And I want to draw specific attention to when he says, dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race, because this is how we view drone strikes. We believe that we're attacking and killing people that pose a threat to our civilization or our race. And that is, again, a way that we justify that. And so, though we have those mentalities, we need to start asking ourselves questions. Mainly, what are we willing to sacrifice? And how far is too far? And we're not going to be like Robert Walton. We won't have a victor to find stranded in the Arctic to tell us his story and convince us that it's the wrong route to take. We have to ask those questions for ourselves. And so I don't propose Frankenstein as a solution to the problem or any problems that might occur, but merely a guide to check our progression and a warning that points to the possible consequences if we fail to do so. Thank you.